menagerie.
Open on black and white footage of a child dancing, curls bouncing, a smile so bright it could cut through the darkest of rooms. She was 6 years old, and the whole world was watching. Not just America, the whole world. Presidents sought her company. Foreign leaders knew her name. Children who had never set foot in a cinema theater somehow knew her face. And in the depths of the worst economic catastrophe the United States had ever endured, this little girl with golden ringlets and a dimpled smile did something that no politician, no banker, no general could manage. She gave people hope. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The little girl who saved Hollywood's box office during the Great Depression grew up to save something far more important: a Cold War nation's dignity in West Africa, a revolution in Czechoslovakia, and the lives of millions of women who were never given the words to talk about their own bodies. Shirley Temple's story is not a story about childhood. It is a story about one of the most extraordinary and improbable arcs in American history. From a 3-year-old spotted in a Los Angeles dance class to a diplomat standing in Prague as the Iron Curtain came crashing down. This is the real Shirley Temple. And it is far more remarkable than the movies. Visuals: Santa Monica Pier, 1920s California, Great Depression newspaper headlines. Shirley Jane Temple was born on April 23, 1928, in Santa Monica, California, a city that still had the smell of salt air and possibility about it, even as the world began to darken. Her father, George Temple, worked at a bank. Her mother, Gertrude, stayed home with their 3 children. By all accounts, they were a solid, loving middle-class family. In a 1988 interview, Shirley would describe her mother as the most wonderful mother that a girl could have, and her parents as people who bathed me in love my whole life. No stage parent mythology here, no ambitious mother pushing her reluctant daughter into the lights. If anything, Shirley recalled, it was she who pulled her mother into new experiences, not the other way around. In October 1929, just 18 months after Shirley was born, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression that followed was not merely an economic event. It was a psychological catastrophe. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Families lost homes, savings, dignity. Men who had spent their lives building something watched it vanish overnight. The national mood was one of exhaustion and despair. And then a 3-year-old wandered into a dance class and changed everything. Gertrude Temple had enrolled her young daughter at Meglin's Dance School in Los Angeles, where Shirley's obvious talent and magnetic presence quickly attracted attention. According to her film career records, a director from Educational Pictures named Charles Lamont was scouting the school for young talent when he first spotted her. She was reportedly hiding behind the piano, already displaying a shyness that would forever contradict the boldness of her performances. Lamont reportedly knew immediately that he had found something rare. She was contracted at $10 a day. Visuals: 1930s Hollywood studio lots, film reels, period newspaper advertisements. Her first professional engagements were a series of short comedic films called the Baby Burlesques, one-reel productions in which young children were costumed as adult Hollywood stars and placed in comedic parodies of adult situations. The New York Times, in later coverage, would describe them as sexually suggestive shorts in which children imitated screen icons like Marlene Dietrich and Mae West. Shirley, wearing costumes that mirrored the adult glamour of the era, was the center of many of these productions. By modern standards, the Baby Burlesques raise serious ethical questions about the treatment and presentation of child performers. The conditions were also reportedly harsh. According to reports based on Temple's own memoir, children who misbehaved on set were punished by being locked in a small, windowless soundbox with only a block of ice to sit on. Shirley Temple later addressed her early career with characteristic candor in her 1988 autobiography, Child Star, a best-selling memoir that became one of the most honest accounts of what it meant to grow up inside the Hollywood machine. She did not romanticize it. She described the industry in precise, clear-eyed terms: the long hours, the adult pressure placed on small shoulders, the way a child's value was calculated entirely in box office returns. In Child Star, she also described an incident with MGM producer Arthur Freed, a powerful and celebrated figure responsible for some of Hollywood's most beloved musicals, who exposed himself to her in his office when she was a young teenager. Not understanding what was happening, she laughed. He reportedly threw her out of his office. She never appeared in an MGM film again, and this remained one of the reasons she never returned to work for that studio. The incident was not reported at the time. Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s operated by its own rules, and its own silences. But Shirley Temple's story is not one of defeat. If anything, it is one of extraordinary forward momentum, a life that refused to be defined by the environment it grew up in. Visuals, colorized film stills from Bright Eyes, Little Miss Marker, Heidi. In 1934, everything changed. Shirley Temple appeared in her first major feature film, Stand Up and Cheer, and the audience response was unlike anything studio executives had seen. She followed it with Little Miss Marker, Bright Eyes, and over a dozen more productions that same year, a release schedule that would be unthinkable today. It was Bright Eyes that launched her into genuine legend. The film was written specifically for her, and it contained the song that would follow her for the rest of her life, On the Good Ship Lollipop. She performed it with the kind of effortless charm that cannot be manufactured or taught, the sort of presence that either exists in a performer or doesn't. In Shirley Temple, it existed in abundance. In February 1935, she received a special Juvenile Academy Award, the first ever given to a child, recognizing her outstanding contributions to motion pictures in 1934. She was 6 years old. The records confirm what the feeling of those years already told. From 1934 to 1938, Shirley Temple was Hollywood's #1 box office draw 4 years in a row. Not the most popular child star. The most popular star, full stop. Above Clark Gable. Above Gary Cooper. Above everyone. In an era when a movie ticket offered the only affordable escape from grinding poverty, people chose to spend their last coins on a film with Shirley Temple in it. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who understood the psychology of a nation in crisis better than almost any leader of his era, acknowledged what she represented. He reportedly said that as long as the country had Shirley Temple, they would be all right. Coming from the man who had to manage the New Deal and the Depression, that was not a casual compliment. Her films from the mid-1930s, The Little Colonel, Curly Top, Captain January, Heidi, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, were not just entertainment. They were medicine. Studies of that era have credited her films with providing genuine psychological relief to Depression-era audiences. There was something in the combination of her talent and her timing that functioned as a national antidepressant, delivered at 25 cents a seat. She also broke barriers that the era rarely acknowledged. Her tap dance sequences with Bill Bojangles Robinson in The Little Colonel and The Littlest Rebel were some of the first instances in Hollywood history where a white child and a black performer were shown as genuine partners, sharing the screen with warmth and equality. In the segregated America of the 1930s, these moments were quiet but significant. Shirley Temple dancing hand-in-hand with Robinson in ways that defied the racial hierarchies Hollywood had otherwise taken for granted. Visuals, 1940s film stills, studio gates, contract documents. By the late 1930s, the magic had started to fade, not because Shirley Temple had lost her talent, but because she had done the one thing the public had never bargained for: she grew up. Audiences who had fallen in love with a 6-year-old did not know how to love a 12-year-old. She was no longer the magical, untouchable child. She was becoming a person, and that was not what they had paid to see. Her contract with 20th Century Fox was not renewed in 1940. The studio, which had built much of its financial survival on her popularity through the Depression years, simply let her go. She was 12 years old. This moment is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something important not just about Shirley Temple but about the economics of childhood fame. She had, by some estimates, earned the studio millions of dollars, a sum that dwarfed what any other star of the era had generated. And when the returns began to dip, she was released like a staff member whose department had been downsized. She went on to work at MGM, and then at other studios, making films through her teens and into early adulthood. Some were well received. Since You Went Away, 1944, earned critical praise. The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer, 1947, alongside Cary Grant and Myrna Loy, was commercially successful. But she was no longer the phenomenon she had been, and the industry treated her accordingly. In 1945, at 17 years old, she married actor John Agar. The marriage produced a daughter, Linda Susan, but proved deeply unhappy. Agar struggled with alcoholism, and the marriage ended in divorce in 1949. She spoke of this period candidly in later years, not with bitterness, but with a clear-eyed honesty that characterized her approach to her own history. Then, in 1950, she met Charles Alden Black, a naval officer and later an aquaculture engineer and oceanographer. By every account, this was the partnership that defined the rest of her personal life. They married in 1950 and remained together for 55 years, until Charles's death in 2005. They raised 3 children together. When Shirley Temple Black died in 2014, her family described her as a beloved mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and adored wife of 55 years. That phrase, adored wife of 55 years, is a quiet but powerful counterpoint to the turbulence of her early career. She made her last feature film, A Kiss for Corliss, in 1949. She was 21 years old. She walked away from acting without drama or announcement. And then she began the second, arguably more remarkable chapter of her life. Visuals: Capitol Hill, United Nations Headquarters, 1960s America. It began gradually, as reinventions often do. Through the 1950s, Shirley Temple Black, she had taken her husband's name, found her footing in a quieter domestic life, raising her children in the hills west of Palo Alto. She hosted a television anthology series, Shirley Temple Storybook, from 1957 to 1959, which introduced classic fairy tales to a new generation and was warmly received. But television was never where her ambitions truly lay. What drew her was the world of ideas and policy, the serious, unglamorous work of governance. She became involved in Republican Party politics in California and, in 1967, ran for a vacant congressional seat representing San Mateo County. She lost, narrowly, to a more established candidate. Another actress might have retreated. Shirley Temple Black took notes and moved forward. Her real opening came through an unexpected door. At a diplomatic party in the late 1960s, she found herself in conversation about Namibia, then a contested territory under South African control and a major point of international controversy. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, overhearing the conversation, was reportedly startled by her depth of knowledge. In her own words, "He was surprised that I even knew the word." That surprise, she later recalled with characteristic dry humor, said more about other people's assumptions than it did about her. In 1969, President Richard Nixon appointed her as a delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. She was 41 years old. She had been out of Hollywood for nearly 20 years. And she was just getting started. Visuals: Across Skyline, West African Markets, American Flag at Embassy. When President Gerald Ford appointed Shirley Temple Black as U.S. Ambassador to Ghana in 1974, the announcement was met with a particular kind of skepticism. The skeptics were not entirely wrong to ask questions. She would be one of the first women to hold such a senior diplomatic post, in a region where American interests were complex and the political landscape was shifting rapidly as African nations consolidated their post-colonial identities. But she disarmed the skeptics quickly, and in ways that revealed something true about her character. On arriving in Accra, she made a point of learning how to say "welcome" and "thank you" in local Ghanaian languages. She appeared at her desk wearing a printed cotton Ghanaian outfit, a headscarf and gown, rather than the expected Western diplomatic attire. She met with the Market Women's Association, embracing them as, in the words of one contemporary account, sister working girls. The Associated Press reported from Accra in 1975 that the new ambassador startled the embassy pros by discussing the Ghanaian economy in considerable depth and detail. The career diplomats who had quietly doubted her credentials found themselves revising their assumptions. There was also a particular resonance to her presence in West Africa that went beyond politics. Her film collaborations with Bill "Bojangles" Robinson in the 1930s had reached West African audiences, and many Ghanaians knew her from those early films. According to the Diplomacy Center Foundation, her work with Robinson had introduced her to Ghanaians as a childhood friend. That pre-existing warmth, earned not through diplomatic calculation but through the genuine partnership she had shown with a black performer decades before civil rights forced the issue, gave her an unusual foundation on which to build relationships. She served as ambassador to Ghana from December 1974 to July 1976. When she left, the skeptics had been largely silenced. Visuals: White House state dinners, formal diplomatic ceremonies, Gerald Ford era. In 1976, President Ford made history a second time by appointing Shirley Temple Black as Chief of Protocol of the United States, the person responsible for managing the formal ceremonial dimensions of American diplomatic life, from state dinners to the greeting of foreign heads of state. She was the first woman ever to hold this position. The role required an extraordinary combination of skills: deep knowledge of international custom and etiquette, the ability to manage complex logistics under extreme pressure, the social intelligence to navigate the sensitivities of visiting dignitaries, and the kind of natural ease with people that cannot be faked. Shirley Temple Black, who had been managing a public persona since she was 3 years old, and who had spent years navigating the competing interests of studio executives, foreign governments, and international organizations, was arguably better prepared for this role than most people could have been. She served as Chief of Protocol from July 1976 to January 1977. Her tenure was brief, the Ford administration ended, but her impact on the office was lasting. Visuals: 1972 America, hospital corridors, women's health advocacy imagery. Before we continue the diplomatic story, we need to stop here. Because in 1972, before the Ghana appointment, before Chief of Protocol, before Prague, Shirley Temple Black did something that had nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with courage. She found a lump in her breast during her morning self-examination routine, a practice her gynecologist had recommended years earlier. She was 44 years old. The diagnosis was breast cancer. In 1972, this was not a topic that women discussed. Not publicly. Not in the press. Not in polite company. The cultural silence around breast cancer was so complete that many doctors of the era would tell patients they were performing a biopsy, and then, if they found cancer, proceed directly to a mastectomy without ever returning to the patient for consent. Women woke up from anesthesia to find decisions had been made about their bodies without their knowledge. Shirley Temple Black refused to accept this. She underwent a modified radical mastectomy. And then she held a press conference from her hospital bed. She spoke clearly and directly about what had happened, what the surgery involved, and what women needed to know. Her phrase, "The doctor can make the incision, but I'll make the decision," became something close to a rallying cry. It was direct, witty, entirely in character, and medically revolutionary. Patients had rights. Women had rights. The decision about what happened to their own bodies belonged to them. According to the National Breast Cancer Foundation, Shirley Temple Black is considered one of the first public figures ever to publicly share a breast cancer diagnosis with the media. Her disclosure is credited with launching a wave of similar public statements by other prominent women, including Betty Ford and Nancy Reagan in the years that followed, that collectively transformed public awareness and reduced the stigma that had kept countless women from seeking early diagnosis and treatment. Visuals: Prague skyline, 1989 Velvet Revolution crowds, Czech flag with communist emblem removed. The most dramatic chapter of Shirley Temple Black's diplomatic career began not in 1989, but 21 years earlier. In August 1968, she was in Czechoslovakia attending an international conference when Soviet-led Warsaw Pact forces invaded the country to crush the Prague Spring, a period of political liberalization that had given Czechs a brief, extraordinary taste of freedom. The invasion was swift and brutal. According to Newsweek's coverage of her life, she witnessed an unarmed woman protesting communist rule being shot by Soviet forces. The image never left her. She carried that memory for 2 decades. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush nominated her as U.S. Ambassador to Czechoslovakia. She arrived in Prague in August of that year, and within months, the Velvet Revolution had begun. The communist regime, which had held Czechoslovakia in an iron grip for 40 years, collapsed under the weight of peaceful mass protest. A poet and political dissident named Václav Havel became president. Shirley Temple Black was there for all of it. Her embassy became a crucial point of liaison as the country negotiated its transition to democracy. Norman Eisen, who later served as U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic himself, described what happened as career diplomats came to genuinely respect her abilities. As people got to know her, some of the toughest and most battle-hardened professional diplomats, American and otherwise, realized how capable she was. She established a close personal relationship with Václav Havel. When he made his first official visit to the United States as president, she personally accompanied him to the White House for his initial conversations with the American government. That image, America's former child star walking beside a dissident playwright who had become the president of a newly free nation, is one of the more quietly extraordinary scenes of the post-Cold War world. She served as ambassador to Czechoslovakia from August 1989 to July 1992, witnessing the country's peaceful separation into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. She had been present at the beginning of the communist crackdown in 1968, and she was present at its end in 1989. History, in that sense, had given her a full arc. Visuals: diplomatic certificates, State Department facade, Kennedy Center. Let's be precise about what Shirley Temple Black accomplished in her diplomatic career, because the full list is remarkable. She served under 4 U.S. presidents: Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. She was a U.S. delegate to the United Nations General Assembly in 1969 and 1970. She served as deputy chairman of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm, 1970 to 1972. She was U.S. ambassador to Ghana from 1974 to 1976. She was the first woman to serve as Chief of Protocol of the United States, 1976 to 1977. She was a member of the U.S. delegation on African refugee problems in Geneva in 1981. And she served as U.S. ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 1989 to 1992. In 1988, she became the first and only person ever to be appointed as an honorary U.S. Foreign Service officer, a distinction that has never been repeated. She also sat on the boards of directors of organizations including the United Nations Association, the National Wildlife Federation, Bank of America, and the Walt Disney Company. In 1998, she was honored at the Kennedy Center for her contributions to early film and American culture, a recognition that, for once, took in the full sweep of what she had contributed, not just the ringlets and the tap shoes. Visuals, late life photographs of Shirley Temple Black, family images, Woodside, California. The most persistent myth about Shirley Temple is that her adult life was a kind of footnote, a quiet denouement after the explosion of childhood fame. The reality is almost precisely the opposite. She lived 85 years. The famous child star years occupied roughly 6 of them. The remaining 79 were spent doing things that genuinely mattered: raising a family, serving her country, fighting for women's health, standing in the middle of revolutions, and building a diplomatic record that most professional career officers would envy. She understood the tension between her image and her substance with characteristic humor. She reportedly told her son Charles that her greatest professional irritation was not the baby burlesques, not the contract disputes, not the decades of having her work undervalued. It was that her name had been attached without her permission to a cocktail. The Shirley Temple drink, that sweet non-alcoholic mixture of ginger ale and grenadine that had been served in American bars and restaurants for decades, had been trademarked by a soda manufacturer without her consent. She sued, and she won, a legal victory that helped establish the principle that celebrities have the right to control the commercial use of their own name and likeness. Even in her 70s and 80s, friends and colleagues recalled a woman who remained intellectually engaged and productive. Her publicist Cheryl Kagan, speaking to CNN after her death, described a woman who was still busy working right up until the end, writing the 2nd volume of her autobiography and maintaining the same disciplined focus that had characterized everything she had done since childhood. She died on February 10, 2014, in Woodside, California, from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. She was 85 years old. Her family statement read, "We salute her for a life of remarkable achievements as an actor, as a diplomat, and most importantly as our beloved mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and adored wife of 55 years. There is something in that sentence worth dwelling on. In a culture that would have been content to remember her forever as the 6-year-old on the good ship Lollipop, the people who knew and loved her most wanted the world to see the full picture. An actor, a diplomat, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a person. Close on modern-day footage of the United Nations, Prague's Wenceslas Square, a doctor's office, a child taking a dance class. Shirley Temple's life is one of the great underestimated stories in American history. Not because she was a famous child star, though she was, more famously than anyone before or since. Not because she survived a difficult industry and an unhappy first marriage, though she did. But because she refused to be the person that other people's nostalgia needed her to be. She could have spent her adult life doing retrospectives and anniversary appearances, cashing checks based on the image of the little girl with the ringlets. Many people would have been perfectly happy with that version of her story. Some would have preferred it. It's simpler, more contained, easier to put on a commemorative plate. Instead, she went to Ghana and learned to say hello in Twi. She stood in Prague as a nation threw off 40 years of authoritarian rule and helped hold the diplomatic line. She sat in a hospital bed and told women the truth about their own bodies at a moment when the medical establishment was still making decisions about those bodies without asking. She was, in the truest sense, a public servant, someone who understood that the platform fame had given her was not a reward to be enjoyed but a resource to be deployed in service of something larger than herself. In 1934, a 6-year-old girl sang.